Welcome to the SPSS tutorial video on comparing group means with t-tests. In this video we will cover one sample t-tests, independent samples t-tests, and dependent samples t-tests. We'll use the therapy data that we've used in previous videos. First, you'll notice that we have a variable called therapy, which is coded for yes or no, whether participants are in therapy. We also have depression at time 1 and depression at time 2. These are the three variables we'll be using for the examples today. First, we'll see an example of a one sample t-test. Under Analyze, Compare Means, we'll go to one sample t-test. Here, let's look at depression at time 1. We'll select over depression at time 1, and in this case we'll be testing against a value of 0. When we hit OK, our output emerges to test. A significant t-test shows that our value of 46, the mean depression at time 1, is statistically different than the test value of 0, which is indicated here in the table. But if a test value of 0 doesn't make sense, we can change the test value. If I go again to Analyze and one sample t-test, for example, we can test against a value of 60. In this case, it might be that 60 is the clinical depression cutoff for this scale. So we can see whether our group mean is significantly lower than the clinical cutoff by testing against a value of 60 as opposed to a value of 0. Scrolling down in the output, we see that our mean is still 46, and again, this is significantly lower than our test value of 60, which is indicated in the table here. In addition to looking at a one sample t-test where we compare the sample mean to a test value, we can compare two different groups. To do this, we'll do an independent samples t-tests under Compare Means and Independent Samples. In this case, the test variable is our dependent variable. Here, let's look at depression at time 2. Next, we'll look at a grouping variable. The grouping variable asks which groups we want to compare to. In this case, we'll test whether those who are in therapy or not in therapy show a difference in depression at time 2. Once you select over the grouping variable, you also have to define the groups. In this case, our group 1 will be 0 because this was our code in the data set for those who are not in therapy, and 1 will be our group 2 because this was our code for those who are in therapy. Now, if you had your variables labeled differently, instead of 0 and 1, if you had them labeled 1 and 2, for example, you would enter a 1 and 2 here. Whichever groups you ask it to compare will be included in the t-test. If we continue and click OK, we scroll down, the first thing we see is that our two therapy, yes and no, we see the number of people in each group as well as a mean for each group, and a standard deviation, of course. Down below, we see the t-test that compares whether these groups are statistically different for whether we assume equal variances or not. In both cases here, the difference between the two groups, those who are in therapy versus those who are not in therapy, are statistically different. Looking at the means, we can see that those who are not in therapy score a 62 on depression, whereas those who are in therapy score a 34 on depression. The last type of t-test we'll look at is a dependent samples t-test. Under the Analyze and Compare Means, it's called paired samples t-test. You'll hear this called paired samples or dependent samples across different textbooks. In this case, we'll look at two variables that are dependent of each other and not independent. Here we'll use depression at time 1 as well as depression at time 2. I'll select over depression at time 1 for variable 1 and depression at time 2 for the second variable. We click OK. We can see here that depression at time 1 is considerably higher than depression at time 2. But whether or not this difference is statistically significant, we can look down at the bottom of our sample here. We can see that the difference of 4.5 is statistically different in our sample of 149 people. This concludes our use of t-tests, going over one sample t-tests, independent samples t-tests, and dependent samples t-tests.